For model railroaders, using Homasote as the roadbed has been an excellent choice because it deadens sound and holds track nails and spikes like nothing else. But it also creates a dust storm when you cut it. So a couple of companies used to make something called Homabed, which looks like the ubiquitous cork roadbed. It's a strip of Homasote that's 1 inch wide, 3 feet long, and 1/4 inch thick. One edge is 90 degrees and the other is 45. The strips came either plain or with kerfs cut into the sides, which made it possible to follow any route curvature. You could also buy small sheets of rectangular Homabed for use in filling in your turnouts. Bad news is all the companies have closed up and you can't get the stuff anymore. Well, I had a few pieces from long ago still hanging around, and I decided to see if I could replicate the product. Follow me along and see how well I did. Here's what I used. Everything you see here is readily available at your local big box store or online, except the Homasote. That's a lot harder to find. Table saw with a good fence. Any decent saw will do, as the load on the saw is almost nothing. It does need to be able to tilt to 45 degrees, however. The most important part is the saw's fence. Sometimes you'll be making very narrow cuts. Most importantly, you want your cuts to be repeatable. Get yourself a good fence. Oh, I forgot. Get yourself a good fence. Homasote. It usually comes in 4x8 sheets. Actually, this can be quite the trick to find. Technically, there are many varieties available, but you're looking for the most common one, which is called 404 Soundboard. So, take your circular saw with you to the lumberyard, and right there, cut the large panels into 2 3x4 panels and 1 2x4 panel. This leaves some of that junky dust out of your hair. Now, the panels are a lot easier to get into your workshop and are much easier to manhandle onto your table saw. Featherboard, push sticks, rails, clamps. We use all of these to basically save our fingers and also to avoid kickback. Scroll saw. Alternatively, you can use a bandsaw. The key thing is to get a blade with a narrow kerf. You really can't do this with a saber saw. Dust collection system. Given the notorious dust issue, I probably should have listed this first. The only way to keep from making an unholy mess is to devise some way of sucking up that fine dust while it is being produced, meaning while you are cutting. I am fortunate enough to have a high volume system in my workshop, and it does a great job on almost everything, including Homasote dust. Even with that beast, however, I still need a shop vac hose for a few situations. Do invest the time to design something to catch your dust before you begin. Otherwise, you're going to stop and design it later. Optional things? A digital caliper. I find it easier to take small measurements with this device, and by God, it's dead on. True, we do not need machine shop accuracy in this effort, but it's nice to know just how far off you really are. Small mistakes can add up. Digital angle finder. Well, it's really not optional, I guess. If you don't have one, get one. It simply makes setting up any angle on your table saw blade much easier and more accurate. Making a strip of Homabed requires 4 cuts on the table saw. First, cut a strip from the panel that is 2 7/8 inches wide and either 3 or 2 foot long. Next, take that strip and cut it in half at a 45-degree angle, yielding 2 strips. Then, take those strips and trim them to 1/4 inch thick. Finally, trim the strips to 1 inch wide. Step 1. Cut strips of 2 7/8 inch width. First of all, set your saw fence at 2 7/8 inches. This doesn't have to be that exact, but get real close. You're actually going to be cutting a strip that's a little more than twice as wide as the final product. We'll use the next bevel cut to make 2 strips out of this one. Set your saw blade angle at 90 degrees by first turning on your digital angle finder and placing it on the table saw base. Once it settles down, push the 0 button, and that sets the saw table to be the reference point of 0 degrees. Now, place the angle finder on the side of the blade so that it sits flat on the blade. Don't let it touch any high spots. Now adjust the saw blade so that the angle finder reads 90 degrees. Affix a rail to the fence to prevent kickback. I clamp a piece of 1/8 inch by 1/2 inch aluminum bar to the fence so that the bottom of the bar is just a bit above the thickness of the Homasote. On the 3x4 panels, you'll feed the panel through with the 3-foot edge against the fence. You'll just make the same cut, that is 2 7/8 inches by 3 foot, until you're done. On the 2x4 panels, initially you'll feed the panel through with a 2-foot edge against the fence. So your first strips are actually going to be shorter than 3 foot. They're going to be 2 7/8 by 2 foot. Big deal. You're not selling these. They're for your own use. Once you've worked your way down to a 2x3 panel, rotate the sheet and make the rest of your strips 2 7/8 by 3 foot. Or you can all make them 2 foot. I don't care. Once you have everything set up, fire up your saw and make your cuts. Step 2. Cut the bevel on the strips. Set your fence at 1 11/16. This doesn't have to be dead on, but again, get it as close as you can. Set your saw blade angle at 45 degrees. Here is where you really need to be right at 45 degrees, otherwise your pieces aren't going to match up very well. Again, affix a rail to the fence to prevent kickback and to keep the material flat on the table. You can use that aluminum bar, just reposition it. Please note, my saw has a right tilting arbor, which means the blade tilts to the right when viewed from the front of the saw. My fence is to the right of the blade. Normally, you would never ever make the cut I'm about to show you, but with apologies to stumpy nubs, this is a relatively safe cut to make because, number one, the actual material is pretty soft, and even if it does kick back and hit you, you ain't going to be hurt. And two, with the presence of the aluminum guide rails and the push stick, it's pretty easy actually to prevent the dreaded kickback. Fire up your saw and make your cuts. Step 3. Trim the strips to 1/4 inch thick. Set your fence at 1/4 inch. This is the time you need to be anal with your measurements. If you are off by hardly anything, your strips will not lay even with each other, meaning there will be a lip or a dip where your strips meet end to end. If you have difficulty setting your fence using your own fence guide, you can cheat. First, make a master template by taking a piece of hardwood. Cut a few strips of hardwood with a dimension of 1 inch by 15 inches by 1/2 inch. Now, take as much time as you need to set your fence to as close to 1/4 inch as you can. Set the fence, make a test cut with one of your strips, and measure it with a digital caliper. Pick the best one out of the lot and mark it as Master. Do not throw away. Store it in a safe place. Put it in your will. From now on, you can place the master along the blade on its edge and bring the fence up so that it just touches the master piece. Be sure to place the master so that it spans the entire length of the blade. That's why we made it 15 inches long. Set your blade angle at 90 degrees. Put your rail on the fence to prevent kickback and to keep the material flat on the table. Now, to make the cut, position the strip with the beveled edge pointing up and the narrower side against the fence. As you look down the strip, From where you're standing, you should see this profile. Use a featherboard to keep the strip against the fence. Now, fire up the saw and make your cuts. Step 4. Trim the strips to 1 inch wide. Set your fence at 1 inch. This is also a time to be careful with your measurements, but it's not quite as critical as the last step. If you're off by very much, the strips will not match up nicely at the base when you lay them on the sub-road bed. However, since you'll likely be ballasting them, the smaller variation will be seen. Use the same technique that we described in the last step to make a master, and then use that to set your fence if you're having difficulty getting a repeatable cut. Set your saw blade angle at 90 degrees, same as before. Affix a rail to the fence to prevent kickback and to keep the material flat on the table. Now, to make this cut, position the strip with the bottom of the strip actually pointing up and the flat edge away from the fence. As you look down the strip, this is the profile you should see. Now fire up the saw and make your cuts. At this point, what you should have is a bunch of straight strips ready for use. However, they can only be used where your track is straight. To make the strips curvable, we have a little bit more work to do. To make a strip curvable, we need to cut slits in the side. Here's what we'll do. First, stack 6 strips together and tape them to minimize your work. Next, carefully mark where you are going to cut your slits. Lastly, cut the slits. Assemble 6 strips into a stack. Place 3 strips oriented the same way on top of each other. Take 3 more strips, put those on top of these, but reverse the orientation. So you have 3 on top with one direction, 3 below it on the other direction. Use masking tape to hold the stack together. Step 2. Mark the cut lines. Make your marks on the top of the topmost piece of the stack. You want to mark the center line. Mark spots at every ½ inch on that center line. Now, along the top edge, move over 1/4 inch and mark spots at every ½ inch along the edge. Now, connect the spots to mark the cut lines. Step 3. Cut the slits. Get your dust collection in place, although there's not much dust to worry about at this stage. Use your scroll saw to cut out each cut line. Keep in mind that you will be cutting through 6 layers of Homabed with each cut. Yes, it does take a lot of time and attention to detail to make your own Homabed, but since you can't buy it anymore, this is your only choice. If this is what you want to use. If you have suggestions on how to improve the process, please comment below. Also, please note, the finished product will be 1 inch wide and 1/4 inch thick, 90 degrees on one edge and beveled to 45 degrees on the other edge. With 2 strips next to each other, this allows you to maintain a 2 inch track center. While this was the profile of the product produced by the original manufacturer of Homabed, later on a second company began making Homabed, and their product was actually about 1 1/16 inch wide, and it was beveled to 30 degrees. This gave a more gradual slope. While increasing the width is fairly easy to do, fashioning a 30-degree bevel was a lot more than I was willing to tackle. Plus, I personally didn't want to accept a wider minimum track center. Anyway, thanks for watching.